and individual people, rather than thinking of it strictly in a framework of nation states as units. He says seemingly opposed forms of population control thus ran parallel, leading to suffering and death for those caught in the middle. And this is what I was getting at in answer to that earlier question, right? So on the one hand, you have groups that are actively trying to sterilize populations, to introduce various forms of birth control, whether it's condoms or the pill or IUDs, to try to control women and prevent pregnancies. On the other hand, you've got groups like the Catholic Church fighting those measures and trying to essentially prevent access to abortion and birth control for women, leaving those women sort of without options that they might otherwise have had. And I think his sympathies lie with those who suffered and died because they were caught in the middle of these opposing forces, most of which were essentially beyond their control, right? But he turns around and says, most importantly, the fate of population control was ultimately decided by people who would not be controlled. And this is the it didn't work part of the story. Ultimately, all of these efforts foundered, I should say. I love it when I mistakenly invoke a fish. Foundered precisely because at the end of the day, decisions about whether or not to have children weren't completely controllable from afar, right? No matter how aggressive the bureaucracy, no matter how well funded, no matter how powerful the state or non-state entities promoting these things, ultimately, these decisions were not ones that they could completely control. And so they failed. And to some degree, this is the kind of thing we see when we read these articles, the Economist, Pierce, the earlier Economist. The things that do affect these decisions are not likely to be the direct policy interventions of agencies aiming to control them. They're likely to be byproducts of other developments that aren't motivated directly by controlling population, such as better access to healthcare. Did you have a question? Okay, how much time do we have? You might know better than I do. 20 minutes. Okay. So first, let's talk about the demographic transition. I mean, he situates this beginning in the latter half of the 19th century. So this is the takeoff of Western European industrial capitalism, incredible economic growth. We've seen this already, economic growth that far outpaced population growth, but it was accompanied by extraordinary declines in mortality, extraordinary increases in life expectancy. You saw population growth in Europe that was explosive. He says by the time this had played itself out, the European population had become 1/3 of the world's total population, much greater than it had been 100 years before. This eventually leads to declines in fertility, and this gives rise to that great concept from demography that we've talked about already, the demographic transition. And the demographic transition gets equated with ideas of modernization and development. This becomes, and this is still the framework in which most people who talk about these things still talk about it. Again, the economists, Pierce, they're both insisting the demographic transition is happening. It's happening all over the world. Fertility rates are falling. We're getting there, right? We're getting to that stabilization that we saw previously in Europe. But he points out, Connolly points out, that the more the demographers looked at this, the more closely they sort of scaled down and looked at different parts of Europe and tried to pinpoint exactly how this worked, the more trouble they had in sustaining this idea of the demographic transition, or at least the mechanisms that drive it. Right? He says the idea was, well, people will get more educated, they'll get more wealthy, they won't want to have more children. But they found places where they started having fewer children before they got wealthier, before they went from agriculture to the cities, that kind of thing. That upon scrutiny, there had not been one demographic transition, but many. So even if this appears to hold at the sort of gross scale of Europe as a whole, or England as a whole, when you really dig down into it and try to make sense of it at smaller scales, you have a hard time pinpointing specific mechanisms. The only factor that has consistently and convincingly been found to correlate with lower fertility is increasing women's education. That's Connolly's words. And that is, to some degree, the message that he's going to finish the book with. He's going to come back to this. He's basically going to say, if you're concerned about population growth, then this is what you should pay attention to. You should concern yourself with the education and well-being of women, which is exactly what The Economist says, right, at the end of that article. On the other hand, you can look at Pierce, who says, well, wait a minute, there are places in the world where fertility is declining even though women's education levels remain low. So perhaps even that sort of thread of consistency is lacking if you look closely enough. In any event, he then goes on to detail, and a lot of it, several pages of it, provides about as concise a summary of Mike Davis's argument as you could hope to find, right? He runs us through that very story that Davis tells in even greater detail. He says Europeans had begun to live longer partly because people in other parts of the world were suffering deprivation and dying young. The exploitation of people and resources in the third world, the creation of the third world, if you take Davis's argument at its full measure, were enabling Europeans to have cheaper food and eventually also to have longer lives, to be healthier, better fed, and live longer. So their benefit, so to speak, the very beginnings of this demographic transition were themselves perhaps conditioned by international or global circumstances of imperialism and colonialism, right? So it's just at this point that demography emerges as a discipline. The first international conference or Congress of Demography was in 1878. So it's really in the midst of that drought famine in India that Davis made the sort of beginning point of his story, right? Systematically counting and categorizing people, assigning each one an exclusive ethnic identity. Connolly suggests that demography was born from a colonial need to control people by the pursuit of and use of knowledge and information about people. And demography was the special scientific discipline created to meet this need. Keeping track of people, and keeping track of people on these kinds of scales required categorizing them in some fashion, right? Coming up with groups to which you could assign individuals and treat them as groups. And ethnicity, ethnic identity, or race serves as a very key category in the emergence of demography itself. Beginning in the 1890s, proposals to use eugenics to eliminate social problems like crime and alcoholism became commonplace. Once you have information at the scale of these groups, these categories, and you begin to see patterns, you can then begin to propose policies aimed at controlling various variables through controlling populations. And the fact that The Economist, again, is doing this today strikes me as instructive, right? If you're worried about crime, you should worry about imbalance between boys and girls in birth ratios, that kind of thing. It's exactly that kind of thinking. So I guess the core take-home point that I want to stress with this is that, in this sense, demography cannot be separated from, if not racism, then at least race thinking. Thinking in terms of race. This is a point that has been emphasized in connection with the rise of fascism in Germany and linked to colonial administration. Scientific advances that made it possible to plumb the origin of species and prolong life also provided language for and lent prestige to those who would depict social, economic, and political inequality as manifesting biological differences. So, I don't know, it's pointed out somewhere in these readings that Darwin himself was inspired by Malthus. Is everyone familiar with that? Darwin explicitly concedes that his idea of competition was sort of clicked in his brain when he read Malthus. And he said to himself, Malthus is talking about people, but I think this actually applies at the level of natural selection among organisms, that there is competition, and those who succeed the best due to mutations and evolutionary change and the sort of fit between them eventually outbreed the others. This is the mechanism driving natural selection for Darwin. And Darwin admits that this is an idea that came to him while he was reading Malthus, which is intriguing. But in any event, the 19th century sees the rise of the use of these categories as biological attributes, and thereby the naturalization of inequality as a function not of social relations and politics and economics, but instead as a function of biological characteristics, race being an obvious one that people map onto this, right? So it becomes possible to make arguments about the behavior of, say, native peoples in the colonies in terms of biological attributes and characteristics rather than as a result of historical, political, and economic inequalities. He sees, therefore, colonial roots for demography and, by extension, for the struggle to control world population. He says in the colonial setting, rather than addressing political and economic inequality, imperial administrators blamed divergent population trends, even if they preferred to leave it to international and non-governmental organizations to pick up the pieces. A transnational network of population experts took up where empires left off. An undergraduate student of mine has actually looked into this very closely in the case of British colonial Africa, specifically what's now Zambia, was known then as Northern Rhodesia. And you actually see between 1900 and 1930 a flip in which initially the colonial officials were concerned about underpopulation. They were concerned that there weren't enough native peoples in this colony to essentially provide sufficient labor for the copper mines. And they complained about the lack of human peoples, of sufficient people in the colony, natives. And they crafted policies intended to sort of drive people into the arms of the mining companies where they could work. On the other hand, 30 years later, they had concocted this elaborate system of knowledge. They had mapped the country's soils and mapped the agricultural practices of the native peoples and concluded that the countryside was overpopulated and at risk of famine because the native peoples were not practicing agriculture that was sort of properly matched to the soil types and sort of ecological potential of the colony. And in this way, they managed to sort of not only strip out the question of labor supplies for the mines, but strip out all questions of race and treat it purely as an ecological problem. And what did they do? They remapped things according to the way they thought it would be more optimal, and they forcibly relocated 150,000 native peoples so to match them to where they said they could grow adequate crops, and forced them to grow their crops differently to meet this sort of scientific assessment of the fit between peoples and resources. Yes? A struggle to define a scientist. They seek truth, but that's not true. I mean, it's a nice way of putting it. I mean, yes, right? I mean, the science is always a social practice embedded in social relations, right? And in this case, yeah, you can. It's there in the archives. All these files that were generated by the colonial Department of Agriculture and that mapped soils and populations of people and agricultural practices. All, I mean, this actually went on to inform a whole generation of ecological anthropology, right? The calculation of carrying capacities, you know, matching soils and vegetation and climate with certain kinds of agricultural practices. And it was done. It was important that it be seen as somehow scientific and objective because that fulfilled certain norms of ethics, right? And yet it was also used in ways that clearly were informed by political needs and expediencies. The interesting thing is that by the time the British left Zambia, it would appear as though they had completely stopped thinking about it in racial terms. The racial part was sort of obscured behind these apparently objective calculations based purely on, you know, agricultural management practices, soil types, vegetation, climate, that kind of thing. But the point that I want to emphasize is that these roots get, you know, they have post-colonial continuities, right? The entire struggle to control world population after the fall of colonial empires, Connolly is suggesting, is actually quite continuous with the racial categorizing and race thinking of the earlier period. And I think, whoa, I thought there were more slides than that. So he emphasizes, for example, eugenics, which we think of as being thoroughly discredited. We think of it as being specifically somehow fascist or Nazi. If you read it all widely in the sort of intellectual history of the teens and 20s and 30s, even in this country, eugenics was extraordinarily widespread as an ideological perspective, and it was by no means limited to people who sympathized with Hitler or the Nazis. You can't adequately think about these problems without coming to terms with the racial inflections that informed them from the beginning. And as we look more closely at the later history, 1950s and 60s and 70s and so forth, detailed in Connolly's book, the race aspect may frequently be intentionally obscured, but many of the people at the forefront of these movements were in fact constantly thinking, how do we make sure that the people we don't identify with, whether because they're poor or because they're non-Christian or because they're not white, how do we control their population growth in a negative direction and thereby, or perhaps simultaneously, try to increase the number of people like us? Okay, I think I'm out of time. No, not quite. Other questions or comments, thoughts? Yes? Does he take into account the fact that people just get pregnant and don't plan it? The Romanian countryside in the 1860s was not subject to state intervention to control births, pregnancies and births. I suppose you're probably right. Are you talking about Connolly or are you talking about the people Connolly's talking about? In many ways, this is a story about people in one part of the world or certain parts of the world, and he emphasizes the U.S., getting exercised about the birth and family planning decisions of people in other parts of the world, some of whom we might, yes, think were not sort of within the reach of these types of policies and programs. And the intention was precisely to bring them within the reach of policies and programs and to either make available to them or in some cases force them to use technologies to control when they got pregnant or whether they got pregnant. Does that answer your question or not? Oversight? ultimately people just get pregnant. Well, yes, it can happen that way. I think the point here is that, yes, at the scale of an individual couple, there's no telling exactly how much conscious planning goes into these types of events, right? It's precisely that patterns emerge at larger scales that creates at least the impression that control can be exercised indirectly, right? Or from afar. Okay, we will see you on Thursday.